Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to another deep dive. We've got quite a bit of material here exploring some really complex ideas, power, how systems change, different kinds of oppression, all through the lens of a story so many of us know and love.
That's right. Today, we're really digging into an analysis that uses the world building of Avatar, the Last Airbender. Specifically, we're zooming in on Ba Sing Se and the group that pulls the strings there, the Dai Li.
Yeah, and for such a long stretch of the show, Ba Sing Se is built up as this ultimate safe haven, right?
Yeah.
The symbol of Earth Kingdom resilience against the Fire Nation.
Right.
But then Teen Avatar arrives, and you pretty quickly realize the real power, maybe the scariest threat, isn't the enemy outside. It's the Dai Li inside. This, all-powerful, totally corrupt, secret police force. It just completely turns that simple good versus evil thing on its head, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the analysis we're drawing from makes a really strong case that the Dai Li arguably become even more frightening than the Fire Nation.
Really? How so?
Because they represent a different kind of it's systemic corruption, internal control, things that are often much harder to see and definitely harder to fight. I mean, think about it. Anang eventually takes down Fire Lord Ozai, the big bad everyone can point to.
Right.
But the Dai Li, as an institution, they're never really defeated or dismantled by the end of the original series.
That's a really potent point. The Fire Nation is like the big, obvious storm, but the Dai Li are, I don't know, like termites chewing away where you can't see.
Kind of, yeah. So our goal here in this deep dive is to unpack what this amazing piece of world building, using the details from this analysis, tells us about these three big questions. How does authoritarianism actually take root? How does corruption really work? And how do these tyrannical systems manage to keep going?
Okay, let's get into it.
So to understand how something like the Dai Li could even happen, how authoritarianism starts, the analysis really stresses you can't look at it in a vacuum. It doesn't just pop up. You've got to understand the whole political environment it grew out of. You need to look at the Earth Kingdom itself.
Which is fascinating because, you look at the map in the show and it looks like this one huge, solid country. But the source material in this analysis, it paints a very different picture, doesn't it? It's less like one nation and more like, 55 sort of independent states, always fighting amongst themselves.
Well, actually, far from unified. It was pretty chaotic, actually. You had constant internal struggles, rebellions, little border wars between regions, and then within the capital, Ba Sing Se, endless court intrigue and backstabbing. The analysis mentions things like the wars of secrets and daggers happening just before Avatar Kyoshi's time.
Wow.
Yeah. So calling it stable or unified, well, that's stretching the definition, according to this perspective.
Okay, so it's not like this peaceful place that suddenly got taken over. It was already, kind of a mess.
Precisely. And that kind of unstable, fragmented environment, it's incredibly fertile ground for an authoritarian movement to step in.
Offering order, I guess.
Exactly. Promising to be the solution to all the chaos and corruption in that kind of system. It's not just an accident. It can become almost a feature, a natural consequence when everyone's fighting for power and willing to bend the rules. And interestingly, that same instability actually made the Dai Li themselves vulnerable later on after Kyoshi, which adds another layer to their story.
Okay, let's zero in on the Dai Li themselves then, because the analysis points out something that just blows my mind every time I think. They were founded by Avatar Kyoshi, the embodiment of order and justice. How does that happen?
It's definitely one of the most striking details, isn't it? According to the sources, they were originally set up with a pretty noble goal, preserving Earth Kingdom cultural heritage.
Okay, that sounds more like Kyoshi.
Right, but the realities of court politics, the constant power struggles, the need to protect their own influence, it sort of twisted them over time.
So they went from being like librarians to secret police.
That's basically the argument, yeah. Their focus shifted. It went from preserving culture, something outward-looking, to preserving their own institution and grabbing power, which is inward. It's a pretty stark example of how good intentions can get corrupted in a hyper-competitive political arena.
Okay, so they become this powerful, corrupt force in the shadows.
Yeah.
How do they actually hold on to that power? How do they make sure they stay in control? The analysis points to a key strategy, getting rid of political pluralism.
Right, political pluralism.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the idea that you can have different groups, maybe with totally different goals or ideas, all working, or at least existing, within the same government system, even in monarchies, Right. Authoritarianism, pretty much by definition, tries to tear that down.
Get rid of anyone who disagrees.
In essence, yeah, it's about systematically removing or silencing opposition. You marginalize them, you paint them as illegitimate, you make it seem like their input is unnecessary, or maybe even dangerous, traitorous. It just chips away at the idea that it's okay to have different voices arguing within the system.
And the analysis highlights a really brutal example of this from the source material, from the Kyoshi novel specifically, The Night of the Silent Sages.
Yeah, that event is absolutely critical. The Earth Sages were this established, powerful group, almost like spiritual bureaucrats, you could say. They had huge influence.
They'd run things before Kyoshi, right?
Exactly. Figures like Zanzu. They had serious sway over the royal family, so naturally they were a major rival to the Dai Li who were on the rise.
So what happened?
Well, the Earth King, maybe pushed by the Dai Li, maybe manipulated, it's a bit murky, orders the Dai Li to round them all up. And the sages get this choice. Bend the knee, pledge loyalty to the king, which really meant loyalty to the Dai Li's faction, or die.
Oof.
Yeah. Most refused. They were killed or locked away, totally stripped of their influence. And the analysis points out this kind of purge. It's a classic authoritarian move. We've seen similar things in real history, like arrests mentioned in places like Turkey.
But it wasn't just about loyalty for the Dai Li, was it?
No, and that's the sharp insight from the analysis. It wasn't just following orders. By getting rid of the sages, they eliminated a huge competitor.
Right.
That move massively strengthened the Dai Li's own position. And very conveniently, it left a bunch of high-level government jobs, empty jobs the sages used to hold. Guess who stepped in to fill them?
Ah, the Dai Li. So they didn't just remove a threat, they grabbed more power by taking over the sages' functions.
Precisely. And doing that made the king and the whole government structure even more reliant on the Dai Li just to function day to day. It really paved the way for them to eventually sideline their last rival, the monarch, which is pretty much the situation IM walks into in Ba Sing Se.
Okay, so purging rivals is one thing. The analysis also talks about how they undermine the rules themselves, like the Constitution, which is wild because the show doesn't really get into it. But the sources suggest the Earth Kingdom actually had a constitution. It was meant to be a constitutional monarch.
Correct. That's what the deeper lore suggests. And the analysis argues the Dai Li, often working with the Earth King, actively worked to weaken that constitution. They wanted to concentrate more and more power in the executive branch, the king's branch.
Why?
Because they planned for that power eventually to flow to them. It was a long game.
How do you even do that? Just ignore the Constitution?
It's usually more subtle than that, more gradual. A key tactic in authoritarian creep is constantly tweaking the rules of the game, the laws, the norms, the procedures in ways that benefit the people already in power.
Making it harder to challenge them.
Exactly. Harder to challenge, harder to remove, harder for any rivals to even get a foothold. So they target things like constitutional limits or legal precedents. They argue for broad, vague executive powers. They say, we need this power to deal with the crisis or whatever the excuse is.
They just keep pushing until those actions become normal.
That's the real danger. They muddy the waters with legal arguments, interpretations, until nobody's quite sure what the rules are anymore, or who has the right to do what. By the time the overreach is obvious, it's already become standard practice. The analysis notes that, okay, the Earth Kingdom wasn't a modern democracy with perfect separation of powers, but the Dai Li were definitely blurring the lines of traditional royal authority, making it really hard to question what they were doing. And this kind of political maneuvering, the analysis connects it to historical examples, like the literati class in Imperial China, who were masters at purging rivals while controlling the flow of information to the emperor.
Okay, let's talk more specifically about corruption. The analysis really treats it as a distinct, almost essential ingredient in authoritarianism. How does that work?
Yeah, it breaks it down into kind of two stages. First, you have the weakening of the institutions that are supposed to stop corruption.
Like courts or internal affairs.
Right. So corruption either doesn't get prosecuted effectively or it gets prosecuted selectively. You know, maybe you go after your political enemies for corruption, but ignore it among your allies.
So the watchdogs are either muzzled or biased.
Exactly. And then comes the second part, which is maybe even more insidious. Corruption becomes essential to how the system actually operates. It's not just happening on the side. It becomes a fundamental part of doing business. Almost everyone has to participate in it or at least tolerate it just to get things done.
Like using accusations of corruption as a weapon, maybe like what happened with the Earth Sages you mentioned.
Very likely, yeah. And the analysis connects this to real-world situations, too. It mentions modern China, for example, where low official salaries in some areas can make bribery almost commonplace, estimating it's a significant drag on the economy.
And the source material itself, like the Kyoshi novels, shows this, right? Needing connections, paying bribe.
Oh, yeah. The Rise of Kyoshi depicts that systemic bureaucratic corruption very clearly. You need connections, you need gold, just to navigate the system. And as the Dai Li infiltrated and took over parts of that bureaucracy, they didn't clean it up. They just turned that existing corruption into another tool for their control.
So corruption isn't just a symptom of bad government. It's actually a tool that reinforces the authoritarian system.
And here's a key insight from the analysis. Corruption actually makes institutions less effective. When people are focused on enriching themselves, on taking bribes, they're not focused on doing their jobs properly.
Right, it distracts them.
It distracts them, it misallocates resources, it weakens the state from within, and it becomes so tangled up with the authoritarian structure that it makes it incredibly difficult for any kind of transparent, efficient, or democratic alternative to emerge.
Wow. Okay, another way this all works is through something the analysis calls patronage networks. What's that about?
This is really a direct result of both the authoritarian control and the systemic corruption we just talked about. Basically, it's when government resources, money, jobs, favors, influence aren't distributed based on need or merit,
but on loyalty.
Exactly. They're handed out specifically to buy loyalty, to reward supporters, and to solidify the power base of the people in charge. It often flows to groups whose support is critical, like the military or key officials, regardless of whether they're the most deserving or efficient.
And the analysis gives a really stark Earth Kingdom example for this, doesn't it? Something about tsunamis and the Ba Sing Se wall.
Yes, that's a perfect illustration. After some devastating tsunamis hit parts of the Earth Kingdom, the king offered aid, but there was a catch. You only got the help if you traveled to Ba Sing Se to work on building the massive outer wall.
So it wasn't just disaster relief.
Not purely. It was a strategic move. It dragged labor towards the capital, it made devastated regions dependent on Ba Sing Se for recovery, and it ultimately increased the central government's power and influence over those outer states. It used a crisis to reinforce control through a kind of patronage.
And if you look at Longfeng, the head of the Dai Li, and his interactions with Ong through this lens,
it really clicks, doesn't it? Longfeng doesn't just see Ong as a political problem. He sees him as someone completely outside his network.
Someone he can't control with favors or threats.
Exactly. Anang has this immense power and influence, but he's incorruptible. He can't be bought or brought into the Dai Li's system of quid pro quo. And people like that, the analysis argues, are incredibly dangerous to authoritarian regimes because they can't be controlled by the usual means. They often get targeted precisely because they're outside that patronage loop.
Though the analysis does add some nuance, which is important. It's not always straightforward.
Right. It mentions places like Singapore, often described as somewhat authoritarian, but with very low corruption. Or Belarus, where sometimes the regime deprives groups it doesn't trust of the opportunity to corrupt rather than using corruption to buy them off. So these are strong tendencies, but not universal laws.
Yeah, reality is always complicated. Okay, let's shift to controlling the narrative. Information control. The analysis really stresses how vital this is for authoritarians.
Absolutely fundamental. They have to manage what people hear and believe about the world, the economy, their own country. They push out narratives that make the regime look good, legitimate, competent.
If they can't just shut down all of their news sources.
Then they work constantly to delegitimize them. They label critics as liars, as enemies, as fake news. The goal is to position the regime as the only trustworthy source of information.
So people just dismiss criticism automatically without even considering the argument.
That's the aim. Don't listen to them, listen to us. And Longfeng's actual job title, Grand Secretariat of Ba Sing Se, the analysis points out, has direct parallels in Imperial China. That role was powerful precisely because they controlled the flow of information to the emperor, shaping what he knew and how he saw things.
And the Earth Sages used to control information too, right? So the Dai Li inherited that power.
They did, and they weaponized it, especially during the chaos and fear of the 100-Year War. They clamped down on any information that contradicted their narrative of Ba Sing Se being impenetrable and the war effort going well.
And the analysis makes the point that authoritarians almost never call themselves authoritarian.
Almost never. They always frame themselves as protectors, as saviors. They're fighting some terrible threat, internal enemies, external forces that only they can defeat. And information control is key to that. They label any opposition, any pluralism as being part of that threat, as traitorous.
The message is, trust only us. Authoritarianism is the price of safety.
Basically, yes. Which brings us to probably the most chilling physical location in Ba Sing Se related to this, Lake Laogai.
Yeah, the re-education facility.
The analysis notes very pointedly that Lake Laogai, where they took dissidents for imprisonment and brainwashing, is directly based on real historical prison camp systems from Maoist China.
Wow.
Specifically, the Laogai and Laoqiao systems, meaning reform through labor or re-education through labor. It's a stark fictional portrayal of using isolation, forced ideology, and information control to just crush dissent.
Heavy stuff. Okay, another tactic the analysis brings up is this reliance on punishment and fear.
Yeah, authoritarian movements generally push for harsher punishments, less focus on rehabilitation, fear of the state, fear of consequences. It's seen as a useful tool for keeping people in line.
And the justification is often that it's necessary to deal with threats.
Right.
Which then justifies giving the state more power and fewer checks.
Exactly. The argument becomes, if you oppose these tough measures, you must be soft on crime, or you must secretly support the rebels, or whoever the enemy of the moment. It's a way to shut down debate about the methods by questioning the motives of anyone who objects.
Kind of painting dissent as dangerous in itself.
Right. And that whole narrative, our nation is under threat, we need extraordinary powers, we need harsher punishment. The analysis identifies that as a classic sign of democratic backsliding in the real world today. While the Dai Li don't explicitly use that exact rhetoric in the show, the analysis points out you see it very clearly later with Kuvira. Absolutely frames all opposition as enemies that only her strong authoritarian hand.
Okay, so they remove rivals, control information, use fear, build patronage networks. How do these systems actually last long-term then, if they're built on such shaky ground?
Well, one crucial element the analysis discusses is indoctrination. It's not just controlling today's news, it's controlling the narrative of history, the understanding of threats, the very way people are taught to think about their society.
And the Dai Li started recruiting kids, right?
Yes. Originally, they weren't child soldiers, but Longfeng changed that. The analysis suggests he started bringing in kids, often vulnerable ones off the street, and training them from a very young age.
To ensure loyalty.
Unquestioning loyalty, yeah. You trap them in the system, you give them status, power they wouldn't otherwise have, but you train them in absolute obedience to the organization, to the ideology. It creates a loyal base for the future and, importantly, might help guard against the internal backstabbing that often plagues these systems, especially when there isn't a clear external enemy to unite again.
The analysis also says these systems are often inherently fragile. That seems contradictory.
It does seem like a paradox, yeah. But the argument is that the very things that keep them going also sow the seeds of their collapse. The normalized corruption creates weak points, easy places for things to break down.
Right.
And the whole system often encourages internal competition and betrayal. Sometimes leaders even have to pit their subordinates against each other just to stay on top. It's fundamentally unstable, inefficient.
Unlike, say, a democracy, which might be slow or messy, but has built-in ways to change leaders. Clear rules for power transfer.
Exactly. Democracy has accepted mechanisms for change, even if imperfect. Authoritarianism resists change. Power is often concentrated in one person or a small group, like Longfeng. Without them, or without a clear succession plan, the whole thing can become incredibly unstable or just fall apart.
That tendency towards self-destruction, it gets passed on.
It often does. The analysis mentions Azula banishing the Dai Li. Why? Well, partly because they betrayed Longfeng. If they betrayed him, why wouldn't they betray her?
Their loyalty was always conditional.
Exactly. Transactional. Based on who held power right now. So the corruption, the backstabbing culture, it doesn't just prop up the current ruler, it actively undermines the stability of whoever comes next.
And this really clarifies why Aang couldn't just, defeat the Dai Li like he defeated Ozai.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about taking out one person at the top. It was a system, a deeply rooted system of corruption, control, and power that had grown over generations. You can't just punch a system into submission.
Wow. Yeah. Looking at the Dai Li and the Earth Kingdom through this specific analytical lens, it really unpacks how these incredibly complicated systems, authoritarianism, corruption, actually work on the ground. It's more than just bad guys doing bad things.
And the analysis is really clear. These aren't just patterns in fiction, however brilliant the fiction is. These are mechanisms, themes, dynamics that have played out again and again throughout history and continue to play out around the world today.
The real world is definitely complex, maybe even more than Bassings say. And what this analysis really drives home is that dealing with these kinds of issues, it requires more than just pointing fingers. It takes real, conscious effort to understand how these systems function, how they take root, how they sustain themselves.
Which kind of leaves us with a final thought. Maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. If an organization that was founded by a figure as fundamentally good as Avatar Kyoshi, with the stated goal of preserving culture, could be warped by its political environment into this corrupt, authoritarian, secret police, what does that tell us about the kind of vigilance, the kind of constant attention and care that's needed to protect institutions in any society, even the ones that seem stable right now? Definitely something to think about.